As you all have read in the newspapers of this age, that there has been a calamity that has befallen our country. As you all have read, on October 16th, 1859, there was a small band of men who staged an attack upon Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The reason that they staged this attack was that they wanted to seize the armaments and give them to the slaves so that the slaves could revolt against the condition that they were in, which is enslavement. John Brown was the man who led this insurrection. And John Brown had come to me, and he had asked me to help him lead this insurrection against this barbarous slave system. I looked at John Brown seriously, and I said to him, "Your plans have changed over the years, John. We were going to create a pathway to freedom for the oppressed slaves. We were going to give them a chance to live free in another part of this world." And John Brown said, "I cannot wait any longer. This system has to be defeated." I looked at John Brown seriously and I said, "John Brown, you are walking into a powder keg, and it's going to blow up all around you." And indeed, John Brown walked into a powder keg, and it blew up all around him. John Brown and his band of men who thought they were going to, overwhelm the United States Army, they were caught. And John Brown was hung until dead. On his way to the gallows, he was asked if he had a final statement before God. And this statement before God rings true to the events that occurred soon after his death. John Brown uttered the following words: "I do believe that the sins of this country are so great that they cannot be purged except they be washed in blood." John Brown has become a premonition that thousands of men will lay down their lives to defeat the God-forsaken system of slavery. And I too, Frederick Douglass, I have become a premonition. What is it that the slave master hates more than anything else in the world? He hates for a former slave, such as myself, to escape, to steal myself away. Isn't that an interesting idea? How do you steal yourself away? You steal yourself away because you are not your own person. You do not own your own being. Somebody else owns you. Somebody else owns you, so you have to steal yourself away. That's why when the slaves would sing, "Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. I don't got long to stay here." They were stealing themselves away, meaning they were going to escape. The only way that you could become your own person was to escape slavery. I too, Frederick Douglass, have become a premonition, a nightmare in the minds of the slave masters. Because I speak out against the slave system and I speak the truth about the slave system. The slave masters hate to hear the words that I'm about to tell you. In order for a man to enslave another, he must strive day and night to defeat the humanity of his downcast brother. He must strive day and night to make that other human being ignorant of his God-given gift of his humanity. And when you strive so hard to defeat the humanity of another human being, the end result is that you destroy your own humanity. And when I publish this in my newspaper, I can hear the groans of all the slave masters across this great country of ours who go to church on Sunday and beat their slaves the rest of the day. But you know, when I was a young boy, I did not know that I was a slave. My first memories of my grandmother Betsy. I remember my grandma Betsy with her waist deep in the water. They called it seine hauling. And she would be fishing. She would take her net and she would throw it out in the water. And she had such a beautiful voice, and she would be singing, "The waters of Jordan are flowing to Zion, flowing home to my Lord." Such a beautiful voice. And my grandma Betsy was also a famous plantain woman in those parts, a fishing woman and a plantain woman. And she brought all kinds of things home that I didn't know was part of the slave system. She was a free spirit, and I thought I was a free spirit. I did not know I was a slave. But one day, my grandma Betsy, she looks at me and she says, "Fred, I want to take you to meet your kinfolk at the main plantation. I want you to meet all the wonderful people who are your half-brothers and half-sisters and cousins." I said, "I have kinfolk?" She said, "Yep, you certainly do." And she said, "You see the little house we live in and the land that stretches for miles and miles in every direction? And you see myself and yourself and all the little youngin' I take care of?" And she looked up at the sky and she said, "We belong to old Massa." And she said it with a degree of reverence in her voice that I didn't realize she had. And I thought she was talking about the old master of the universe. I thought she was talking about God. But in a few days' time, I would let you know what I discovered about the old master she was talking about. We went on a journey to the main plantation. And as we walked through the 10 miles or so to get there, I could have swore I saw a lion coming out of the bushes. And she said, "No, Fred, that ain't no lion." I said, "Grandma, please, it's a lion. He's coming to get us." And she dragged me over and showed me that it was just a big old tree stump that had been pulled up out of the ground. And so I realized, and she told me, that a child's imagination could run away with itself. But still, when you see a lion, whether it's true or not, you still have the emotions. I said, "Grandma, please pick me up. I'm scared still." And she picked me up and she put me on her shoulders. And you wouldn't realize my grandma was an older woman, except her white hairs were hanging down from her scarf. She must have been in her 70s at that time. And she picked me up, a big old strapping young kid, such as I was, and she carried me on her shoulders. And she walked and she walked and she walked. And I saw the main plantation. I said, "Grandma, I feel great." She said, "You should. I just walked with you for 4 miles on my back." And she showed me all the youngins, just like here today. The light-skinned ones, the white ones, the brown ones, the darker ones. She pointed them. "That's your brother Jethro. There's your cousin Eliza. There's your sister Mary." And she just pointed all of them out and she said, "And your brother Perry." these are all your kinfolk. And I said, Grandma, all of them is my kinfolk? She said, every last one of them is your kinfolk. Y'all can hear me still? No problem with the volume? Is this okay? Okay. I can't really tell. And so, I looked at my kinfolk, the colors of the rainbow. But there was something about them I had never noticed before about young people. All of my kinfolk were the wildest sort of people I had ever met in my life. They weren't sitting still and concentrated like the way that you are sitting here. I know there in some parts of the day, some of you might have the same ambitions to go hog wild and go a little bit off the wall. Is that not true, some of you young people in here? Hog wild and off the wall? Well, my kinfolk were off the wall and hog wild the whole time I was there. And I said, Grandma, I do not want to go play with my kinfolk because they're wild. I have never seen children behave in such a manner as these young people. Yeah. And she said, go play with them, Fred. You've been hanging around my petticoats all these years. You see, my grandmother raised me. So I really didn't have a lot of association with young people. And so she said, go play with them. They might toughen you up. Well, reluctantly, I went to play with my young cousins and my brothers and my sisters. And yes, of course, to describe what they were doing would just set your belly laughing. There were some boys standing on their arms, their hands, and they were racing as though they were on their feet. They could run as fast on their arms as I could run on my feet. Can you imagine that? And then there were other young men, a little bit older than myself. They had these very big, strong axes, and they were taking the axes and they were throwing them they were making targets against a big wall, and they would throw those axes like woo, 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 about 40, 50 feet, and they would land square on the target. I've never seen such precision in my life. A young boy, a tiny young fella, he must have been 4 years old, was picked up by one of the larger boys and picked him up and threw him in the air like he was a ball. And the boy just went around and around and around, and somebody caught him. Can you imagine throwing your own kinfolk around like they're a little ball? I'm telling you, I was just totally beside myself with worry and fretting because I did not know what they were going to do to me. As they were getting ready to come over and do something to me, I was getting ready to holler and scream, let me tell you. One of my cousins, he comes into the yard and he says, Fred, your grandmama is gone. What do you mean my grandmama is gone? She's gone. I went out to the front and I said, Grandma, where are you, Grandma? Where are you? She had disappeared into the wilderness, so to speak. My grandma had all that Indian blood in her, and as you know, the Indian people, they know how to disappear and never let you see where they're going. They just walk right out into the wilderness and disappear right in front of your face. They know the secrets of the art of disappearing. And I just didn't understand why she would leave me. She was going to take me back to where we lived. And my brother Perry, he says, you know why your grandma left you here? No, sir, I said. Why? Because you is a slave. And we belong to old massa. And for the first time, I knew exactly what that meant when my grandma said we belong to old massa. And then my brother Perry said, she had to leave all of us children here. It was your time too. And I couldn't be consoled. I started bawling my eyes out. And my brother, he gave me this peach and pear, and I took both of them and I threw them as far as I could because I didn't want to be consoled. I just wanted my grandma. The next day, they took me, in fact, that evening, they took me to the kitchen. Aunt Katie was the woman who ran that kitchen, I guess you could say, like the captain of a ship. The 16 boys that lived in that kitchen, I say lived in that kitchen because we actually had to sleep in that kitchen as our domicile. And we played in that kitchen. We played elsewhere, but this was our locality. The 16 boys would be served food early in the morning, and Aunt Katie, She didn't even take the time to put it in a tray for us. She threw it down in a trough, and the youngins would fight over it like they were little pigs. The young boys were always hungry, and I was always the hungriest because I was the smallest, and the older boys would just throw me around and wouldn't let me eat. Now, Aunt Katie had a sour disposition. And even though she was what I call the woman of the kitchen, her sourness sort of spread evenly throughout. Even though she didn't care for her own children too much, she had 4 children on this plantation, she took a special dislike to me. And one day she comes up to me and she says, "You got to get that look out of your eyes. Ain't nobody on this plantation going to treat you special. I know you've been hanging around your grandma all these years and she treated you like you were God. But you ain't no God. No, sir, you ain't. You just like everybody else. You got to put your nose in the dirt and keep it there." She was trying to teach me the etiquette of being a slave. And what you learn is that you don't keep your head up, you don't look happy, you don't look curious, you don't look smart, you don't look intelligent. You just try to look like you ain't nothing. And that was the logic of slavery, and that's what Aunt Katie was trying to teach me. And I think that's probably why she treated me so bad. One day, as a matter of fact, she actually cooked up a whole mess of cornbread and cut it up into 16 pieces. She gave it to all the young boys in that kitchen except me. And she took my piece of cornbread and went outside with it. And I ran after her and said, "What you gonna do with my cornbread?" And you know what she did? She started peeling it off and throwing it out there for the chickens and all the other little animals to get. And the roosters who came to peck at my cornbread, they were big roosters. They were big right up to my waist. And you don't want to mess with a rooster who's that big. And so my cornbread went to the roosters, and I was hungry, and I went out around the back of the building, and I just cried like a fine fellow. So consequently, I looked at her and I said, "What are you doing with my cornbread, ma'am?" And her reply was, "I hope you starve." Isn't that a fine thing to say to a young boy who's hungry? I hope you starve. This was a turning point in my life, not just because she said, "I hope you starve," but because of what happened thereafter. That evening, when I was looking and searching for more food, I was in the kitchen while everyone was asleep. I was looking in the crevices in the corners of the room, and I was looking for the corn kernels that I could find that get dislodged when you're grinding corn. And I said, well, if I put some of these corn kernels in the hot coals where the stove was, they will pop open. And that would be something that I could put into my mouth. Well, as I was putting those coals, taking the corn kernels out of the coals, I looked up and saw the door opening. And I thought it was going to be Aunt Katie coming to get me because she didn't want me to eat. But it wasn't Aunt Katie. It was somebody I hadn't seen in a long time. Somebody I didn't even tell you about. Some of you know who I'm talking about, don't you? It was my very own mother. Where was my mother all this time? You want to know? My mother, like her 4 sisters, were farmed out by the slave system. It is the logic of the slave system to break families into small units, small individual units, where the sons and the fathers and the sisters and the brothers and the mothers and the children do not have contact with each other. You can be sold from your family, sold to a place and never returned. Imagine being someone's property and having your mother and father sold to gentleman X, and your sister sold to gentleman Y, and you sold to gentleman Z, and you never see them again. This was the logic of the slave system. And my mother had walked about 12 miles to come and see me that night. And she looked at me and said, "Fred, you don't look well, son." And I said, "I didn't eat much today. Aunt Katie didn't feed me none right too much." And she told me, she said, I hoped I would starve. and I could see the blood rushing to my mother's face. And my mother went into Aunt Katie's room and woke her up out of a dead sleep. And I could hear my mother saying, "Don't you ever let me hear you doing this to my son. Because if I was to die this very night, I would come back and haunt you." I could feel Aunt Katie's blood just curdling, because people back in those days believed, they were superstitious, they believed in the other worlds. And when somebody promises you that they're going to come back and haunt you, it makes you very fearful. My mother came into that kitchen, and in some magic way, she was able to cook me up an entire loaf of gingerbread of my very own, and she fed it to me with a whole pint of milk. Where she got these items, I do not know, but she saved me from the jaws of the lion, and she rocked me in a chair until I fell asleep. The next morning when I got up, my mother was gone, but I'll always remember what she did for me. I did not know at the time that my mother was ill and that she had come to see me, maybe her last time that she would see me, which in fact it was. I'll always remember the wonder and the joy that she brought to me that night, the fulfillment, a mother's love for her youngest son. Now, if Aunt Katie took a special dislike to me, there was a woman who was the plantation mistress, Miss Lucretia, who took a special liking to me. Miss Lucretia would save me often when I was very hungry and give me food. When I was being beat up by young boys, she would come and put salve on my wounds. And Miss Lucretia decided that she wanted to send me to Baltimore. And Baltimore was a place I had never been to, but I heard so much about it. You all heard about Baltimore, right? The huge buildings, the wonderful skyscrapers, and all the things that you would never think you would ever see in Baltimore. So she said, "I don't want you to grow up on this plantation to be a field hand. I'm going to send you to live with my brother-in-law and his wife and son, and you're going to become a gentleman cabinet maker in a respectable business." So I went off to Baltimore, and when I got there, I looked at the wonders to behold. It was true. Baltimore was the biggest and best city I had ever seen, bigger and better than anything I had seen on that plantation. And as I walked down the street, I came up to the door where I would be staying with the Aulds, A-U-L-D-S, Hugh Auld, and Sophia Auld, and her son Tommy. I put my knuckles on the door, and I looked down to the ground. I'm not supposed to look at a white person in the eyes because they will have you beaten, or worse, they will call you obstreperous for daring to look them in the face. The woman who came to that door picked my chin right up. She says, "You've got beautiful eyes, son. Don't you look down, ever look down. You look straight up into the beautiful air, the air that's where God and the angels live. And I want you to come into my household, and I want you to be part of my household. I want you to be like my son." I thought I was looking into the eyes of an angel, a woman who's talking to me with such beauty and such joy in her voice. And she treated me like I was her own son. And she would sit down with her son Tommy and put him on her knee. And I would be standing over her shoulder, and she would be opening up the good book. And she would be doing that magic thing. You all know what I'm talking about, in which the words themselves would appear in her mouth, and she would speak them, reading out loud. I said, "Ma'am, could you teach me how to do that magic thing?" She says, "What are you talking about, son? Could you teach me how to put words in my mouth from that book so that I could do that too?" She says, "You don't know how to read, son." I said, "No, ma'am." She says, "We better start then, right?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." And so she taught me the rudiments of reading. And it got to the point where I was able to sound out the different sounds in words, and I said, "The Lord is my shepherd." She was so proud of me. She called her husband, "Hugh, look what Fred can do." What can he do? Look, I opened up the Bible and I started reading, "The Lord is my shepherd," and I looked up at him. He had a scowl on his face, and he was coming at me like this. Sorry, He took the book out of my hands forcefully, and he slammed it down on the table. And then he said, "You get out of here, and don't let me ever see you doing that again. Now get." Then I heard him give a report to his wife. "You shouldn't be teaching this slave to read. It will forever unfit him to be a slave. If you teach him how to read, he's going to want to learn how to write. And then his mind is going to run away with itself. A slave should know only the will of his master and obey it. Besides, if you teach him, if they discover that you've been teaching him how to read, I could be put in jail for, I don't know, maybe 6 months or so, fined $200, and now what's going to happen to your peaceful little household when that happens? It's against the law in this state. It's against the law in this world to teach slaves how to read." I was listening to all of this, even though I was out of the room, and I could hear, like a bell that was ringing over and over again, the words, "If you teach a slave how to read, it will forever unfit him to be a slave." How will reading unfit me to be a slave? That thought never ran away from my mind. It was the core of everything that I would know from then on. Miss Sophia, the woman who taught me how to read, became, in due time, convinced that she should not be teaching me to read, and this angel became my arch enemy. If I was sitting quietly somewhere, she would be running into the room, screeching, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" "Nothing, ma'am. I'm just sitting here playing blackjack." She thought I was doing that nasty thing, which was reading. But I would learn to read just the same. I'd go out into the wide world, the university of free education out there by unsuspecting people who are all your teachers. I would play spelling in the dirt. The young boys would see me walking down the road and they would say, "Here comes the spelling bee. What words you want to spell today, Fred?" And I'd draw this word in the dirt. They say, "No, that's not how you spell that word. This is how you spell it." I must have learned thousands of words by playing spelling in the dirt around the different avenues and alleys of Baltimore. But my fate would change. Even though I got started on this road of reading and learning, my fate was such that I was sent back to the main plantation, and the master of that plantation had gotten remarried because my divine Miss Lucretia had expired. The woman he married was as mean-spirited and stingy as Aunt Katie. Consequently, I was hungry again. So I would do things that were a little bit obstreperous, so to speak. I would let the horses roam where they needed to roam, and I would go after them, pretending that I was taking care of them, while all the time what I was really doing was going over to the next plantation and begging for food. The master saw me doing this a couple of times, and he says, "You got up in Baltimore and looks like it went to your head going up there in Baltimore and letting that free talk get inside your brain cells," he said. "I need to send you someplace where you're going to learn how to be a slave. I should have never let you go to Baltimore. I should have never let my wife send you there. So I'm going to send you someplace here where you can learn to be a slave. I'm going to send you to Mr. Covey's farm." And Mr. Covey was what they called a slave breaker, a man who knew how to deal with men and boys who did not know how to toe the line. So I was sent to Covey's farm, and Covey had one way of dealing with all slaves, no matter what their caliber. It's the same ideology that they used for training horses. Break them down, hit them, beat them until they don't resist anymore. So consequently, Mr. Covey would beat me almost every day. I would have nice scars on my back, and I guess you could say you might wear them as a badge. How many scars you got on your back today, Jim? I got 17. How many you got on your back, Fred? Oh, I got 19. Well, you beat me this week, didn't you? So yeah, we used to play games to give some levity to this dangerous game of being a slave. It got so that Mr. Covey would beat me for any infringement whatsoever. If I looked the wrong way, and Mr. Covey, you know what they called him? A snake in the grass. You know what I mean by a snake in the grass? A man who said, I'm gonna go to town to buy some feed. And the slave said, he ain't going to town to buy no feed. He's going around the back of the plantation so he can watch us do what we do while he's not here. And there, lo and behold, there he was in the weeds, staring at all the slaves to see who he could beat. That's why they call him a snake in the grass. You could never, ever trust him. You never know what foot you were on when you were with Mr. Covey. It got to the point where Mr. Covey beat me so much that my spirit was totally broke. I guess you could say I was a broken man. That liveliness, that curiosity in my eyes had turned to a dark luster of defeat. It was one Sunday that I had one Sunday off. Sunday was one of the days you had off from work. And I was watching the boats on the dock. Beautiful boats, beautiful waters. Have you ever seen a sailboat with white sails? It's like nothing you've ever seen before. It takes your breath away. I sat on that dock and I said, if only I could be one of them sails. If I could just sail away and never come back. I wanted to die. I wanted to be who I was not. The next day we were threshing wheat. It was a hot day. That whole week was hot. By the end of the week, the heat got so hot that it was 120 degrees in the shade. And I was on the first part of the assembly line, throwing one part of the wheat to one man, and he would throw it to another man. And what happened was my body became ill with some kind of queasiness in my stomach and a hotness in my head that only made me feel faint. So I fell to the ground and I crawled over into the shade, because if I had gotten up, I think everything in my body would have come out of my mouth. Mr. Covey runs over and says, you can't stop threshing the wheat now. We've been into this and we got to get it done. Well, Fred is sick. And he comes over to me and says, what's wrong with me? He told me to get up. And the way he told me to get up, he told me with his foot. And his foot kept kicking me in the side. In the pain I was in, I didn't really feel his kicking me. It was like I was numb. He was so upset with me that he took his foot and squared off right and hit me right in the head, and it broke open like a spigot, and the blood just kept pouring out of me. It was lucky my hair was thick at the time, and it was lucky that the thickness of it caused it to clot over so that I didn't bleed to death. But his kicking me in the head was probably a blessing in disguise, because when he kicked me and the blood started running out of my head, the coolness in my body came back, and I could think for the first time, knowing that he was kicking me in this defenseless position. I was already sick. I knew in my heart that this man had no love for me and that he would kill me on a whim. With that knowledge, self-preservation took over. My body got up and it ran in the other direction. I ran and walked all afternoon, all night, and all the next morning until I got to my master's plantation. I don't know how far it was, maybe 20, 25, 30 miles. I just walked. Mr. Covey didn't come after me. Like I said, he knew that whatever would happen to me was my fate. He didn't really care. I got to that plantation and my master looked at me with blood all over my shirt. I had even leeches on my body from some of the swamps that I went into. He says, "What you doing here?" I said, "Mr. Covey is trying to kill me." "Mr. Covey trying to kill you? Ha, 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 ha. He ain't gonna kill you. But I swear to God, if you're not cleaned up and out of here first thing in the morning, I'm going to kill you." You know what I mean? A rock in a hard place. You have no which way to go. Covey's going to kill you. My master's going to kill you. Which way do I go? So first thing in the morning, I pretended I was going back to Covey's farm. Instead, I went into a meadow nearby, found a nice little cove for myself, and I fell into a deep sleep. Maybe 3, 4, 5, or 6 hours had gone by. I think it was about high noon. I could feel something on my foot. I don't know if it was one of them wild animals, or was it Covey coming to find me? Was it a snake? My mind turned to extreme terror. But when I opened my eyes, I saw a friendly face with his hand on my foot. He said, I tried to wake you up gently. It was my friend Sandy. Sandy was a man who was considered to be an unusual man, almost mystical, because Sandy was a slave at one time. He was from Africa. He had been brought to this country 6 years prior. But Sandy was walking around free as a bird, and he was actually married to a free woman. And nobody understood how it is that Sandy was able to run around so free. And Sandy looked at me and he said, "I heard all of the things that were going on with you and Covey, how much he beat you, and I'm here to help you." I said, how can you help me? He says, "Here in my right-hand pocket, I have a root that I brought from Africa." He says, "I kept it secreted in my body, and I put the seeds in the ground, and they've been growing. This root is from Africa, and ever since I put this root in my right-hand pocket, nobody has been ever able to beat me. So I'm going to give you this root. I'm going to give you part of this root, and I want you to put it in your right-hand pocket, and never ever let anybody beat you." And I said to him, "I don't believe in superstition." And then Sandy looked at me with eyes that were penetrating, and he said, "This root is from your homeland," he says. "Take it and put it in your right-hand pocket. You are from a people who are warriors. And don't let any man ever beat you again." So I put the root in my right-hand pocket. Now he says, "Get to Covey's farm." Now Covey, that morning, was on his way. He was on his way to Sunday go to meeting. There was a revival meeting. And so, like I said before, you have these masters who dare to go to church and praise God on Sunday after they've been beating their slaves all week long. So he was off. He tipped his hat to me when I arrived at the plantation, and he was off to his great Sunday meeting. When he come back, everybody is happy with the Lord. He is happy with the Lord. Everybody is singing. "My soul was new when I came out the wilderness. My soul was new when I came out the wilderness." I said, "I loved everybody when I came out the wilderness, leaning on the Lord." I said, "I loved everybody when I came out the wilderness. I loved everybody when I came out the wilderness. I loved everybody when I came out the wilderness, leaning on the Lord." I said, "Is Covey leaning on the Lord? That must mean he's going to go free the slaves." You don't feel the grace of God into your body and spirit without moral consequences, now do you? That was my first thought. He was going to free the slaves. Of course. And the next morning, he come to me and said, "Go hitch up the horses. I got someplace to go." And I knew it. And I was rubbing down the horses and hitching them up. Then he comes into the barn. He says, "Okay, now I want you to go over to the other side of the barn, take all your clothes off because I'm going to beat you to 1 inch of your life. You see what I mean by a snake in the grass? I said, I ain't going to take my clothes off. And he runs at me. You mean to resist? And he just comes at me with his ropes. He's going to tie me up and turn me upside down. But something inside of me, like a mule kick, went out and squished his neck. And with the force of, I don't know where I got the strength from, I held his neck like a vice. It was hard. It was incredible. I could see him losing strength. I could see him looking faint. I could see him going down. And he called out, Robert, come help me. And Robert comes in, and Robert was one of the slaves who wasn't very particular about doing much work. And he says, I wasn't hired to help you beat on people. And Robert ran out. George come in. He says, I'll get that boy off of you. Get that boy off of me. Get him off of me. But George left his body open. He didn't realize that not only had I 2 hands, but I had 2 legs and 2 knees. And when George came near me, my knee hit his rib cage so hard that I think I knocked the wind out of George, and George was no good anymore. My strength was double than what I had ever seen before. And so he called the only other person he could call who might be able to help him, and that was Caroline, and she was the cook on the plantation. Caroline is a majestic woman, and Caroline could have just picked me up with her little 2 fingers like this and threw me across the room. That's how strong she is. But Caroline was in no disposition to help anybody that day, and she looked at him, and she had a smirk on her face. What you want me to do? Get this boy off of me. Get this boy off of you? I ain't doing nothing. So Caroline took herself and sashayed on out of there. Let me tell you. So it's me and Covey for 2 hours. Have you ever wrestled with anybody for 2 hours? I could see 10 minutes maybe. That'll take all the breath out of you. But for 2 hours, the whole time I had Mr. Covey in my death grip. I had drawn some blood from him. He didn't put a scratch on me. And he said, okay, as we fell apart, he says, I would have beat you better if you hadn't resisted so much. The truth is, he didn't beat me at all. The truth is, I had commanded that fight the whole time, and it was only me and him who were witness to it. After that moment, Covey never put his hands on me ever again, because if he even thought about it, he'd look at me in the eyes and he'd realize that he'd have a battalion of other men beside myself working against him. My strength tripled, doubled, quadrupled ever since that day. And I realized that that's what the slave masters hold over you. They hold the specter of death, the specter of horrible, horrible pain. And I no longer was afraid of any of that. I would go down fighting. And when somebody isn't afraid, their strength is unimaginable. And the wind of manhood sort of blew back into my lungs, and my fate would change. And I was sent back to Baltimore. And I got tired of being in Baltimore. I think that experience with the root in my pocket set a whole pattern for me. And I decided to escape from slavery. The Irishmen on the docks would say, you should get on the Underground Railroad. And that's what I did. I escaped from slavery on the Underground Railroad, no longer giving my honest work to someone else because they owned me. I stole myself away in 1838. I got married, had a whole slew of children. And in 1841, I went to Nantucket, and I was invited to speak by William Lloyd Garrison to that abolitionist meeting of people. And I got up and said to them what I'm about to say to you as my concluding remarks. My grandma Betsy was a woman who loved that plantation she lived on. My grandma Betsy was a woman who peopled that plantation she lived on. Her children and her children's children were part of the entire population that fed that plantation, that worked that plantation. All of her kinfolk, all of the people in her bloodline were part of a great work effort on that plantation. When she was 14 years old, she was the wet nurse for the slave master's children. Her breast milk was the milk that fed the plantation owners' sons and daughters. You see what I mean? That woman, I guess what I'm trying to say is probably upsetting to that little baby. I'm going to have to apologize to her when she comes back. That woman lived with reverence, beholding those people in her heart. She was a magic woman. Everything her hands touched turned beautiful and lovely. They said that her hands were magic and everything she touched would grow. A very beautiful root woman. When she was old, in her 90s and 100, she was getting blind. And instead of giving her people to be with her, they put her out in a little shack by herself, treating her like she had nobody else in the world but herself. They were treating her like she was refuse. They were throwing her out. All the work, all the love she gave to that plantation, none of it was reciprocated. William Lloyd Garrison stood up. He says, "Are we going to allow this man to be treated like refuse?" And 300 strong, the people cried, "No." Are we going to allow this man to speak out against the abominations of slavery? And they cried, yes. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do, what I was going to become. I am Frederick Douglass, and I escaped from slavery. And because I am a man, I am and will forever be an abolitionist. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.